Hello, this is Pastor Bill again. I'm recording my message for July 4th. Since July 4th falls on Saturday this year, I'm going to share this message at church this Sunday, which would be June 28th, so a little bit early maybe. This July 4th, of course, is going to be a little different. Not just because of the virus keeping people apart and canceling activities and things such as firework displays and so on, but also because of the turmoil in our nation. I've entitled this message "With Liberty and Justice for All." In our church service this Sunday, we'll be doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and of course it ends with those words, "With liberty, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." In the Bible today, we're going to be in the book of Genesis, if you have your Bible, and we're going to start out in chapter 37. I can tell you now this message is going to be one of my longest ones. I've got a lot to say today, so get comfortable as you watch this, and I hope it gets us all thinking. Some toes may be stepped on. Some ways of looking at things may be, need to be changed, influenced, I don't know. I hope it'll give us all some food for thought. And we just pray, as always, that God leads us through it all, through the Holy Spirit. That everything's said and done, not just in this message, but in our lives. Pray that everything is in God's will and does it the way that's pleasing to Him. In the pages of the Bible, there are very few people who seem to have done nothing wrong that we are at least told. Now, as a descendant of Adam in original sin, we know all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But there are a couple of people I can think of in the Bible that we are told about, and we are not told that they did anything that we would say was wrong. One person I often think of in this category who, as far as we know, did nothing wrong, but we know wrongs were committed against him, a man named Joseph. And we're going to look a little bit at Joseph's life today. Got a storm rolling in here, so if you hear thunder or heavy rain, that's what that'll be about. First of all, we're going to look at Genesis 37, verses 18 through 36. Actually, I want to kind of start out at the beginning of chapter 37, and we'll get to those other verses in just a minute. It tells us in the Bible that Joseph was 17 years old, and he was feeding his flock. And it tells us down in verse 3 that Joseph was liked by his father more than the others. Now, you got to remember, there's 12 children altogether, born from different mothers, to Jacob, who we know was later named Israel by God. But when you have 12 children in the same household, as some of you know grew up in big households, sometimes it's hard to relate to each other. Sometimes it's hard to get your 2 cents in. You want to get some attention, and everybody's trying to do the same thing, and it's kind of hard to sometimes, from what I've seen at least. So at 17, his father, who likes him more than the others, gives him a special coat, if you remember the story, a coat of many colors, it's told in verse 3. And the brothers in his family are jealous because of that. It shows that Jacob, or Israel, loved Joseph more than the other children. Now we know that Jacob, his mother was Rachel, who we know Jacob loved more than the other women in the family. And so that was a big part of what happened there, why he liked Joseph the most. But the other children got jealous, and it didn't help that later Joseph had 2 different dreams, or visions we should say, shown to him by God through his dreams. And each one basically, it's saying that he's going to end up ruling over his family, which of course didn't help anything in his situation. So in chapter 37, let's begin in verse 18. Let's see if I'm in the right place. So at this point, he's had his visions. Let's see. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream. He told it to his brothers. They were all to bow down to him, it tells us. Then in verse 9, he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers. And everybody basically bowed down to him. In verse 10, even his father rebukes him and says, "What's this dream you've dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers bow down to the earth before you?" It says his brothers envied him. His father kept the matter in mind. And so nobody in the family was too happy about it, about what Joseph had told them. And so the brothers go off, and Joseph is sent to go and check, make sure they're all right. And he finds them. And verse 18 is where we are. Now when they saw him afar off, the brothers saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we'll say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, one of the brothers, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let's not kill him." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. They took him and cast him in the pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. They sat down to eat a meal, then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. And so they're eating, and they look off in the distance, maybe on top of the sand dunes, going by, and they see this caravan going by. 26, Judah gets this idea, one of the brothers, says to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit. He had been gone during all this, and he didn't know that they had sold Joseph to the caravan. And so Reuben comes back. And indeed, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and that's what they do when they're mourning, when they're upset. He returns to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph's torn to pieces." And so it goes on and on. Then we get to verse 36 at the end of this section. The Midianites who had bought Joseph, they sell him now in Egypt to somebody named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So my first point today is we see injustice. Injustice at his brother's hands. We see that they're jealous. We see that they were going to kill him. They end up selling him to get profit. They end up making a cover-up story when they dipped his coat of many colors, his tunic, into some blood and went back to the father. So now the father obviously thinks that he is dead. And that's the end of that, they think. It's all done out of hatred. It's all done because Joseph was unjustly treated. It's all done, and his liberty or his freedom is now taken away as he is sold to others. Next point comes from chapter 39 in the book of Genesis as we continue this story of Joseph in chapter 39. And the second point is also injustice. Injustice from a captain's wife. Now, we know the story of Potiphar's wife. You know, we see here that Joseph has been sold to Potiphar, and we know the story of his wife. It says in verse 7 here, in chapter 39, that his master's wife, Potiphar's wife we're talking about, cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." And as you go through and read this, she said that more than once. He turned her down because he was a man of God. He didn't want to sin against God. He didn't want to sin against his master. He didn't want to do something that was wrong. But she kept on after him time and time again. We find out as you read this. Finally, she made up a story and lied about what had happened. And Joseph found himself unjustly in prison. He had done nothing wrong, but he was falsely imprisoned. Now we know the story that eventually God intervened and blessed Joseph so that he became second in command only to Pharaoh in Egypt. So when the famine came to the promised land and his family had to come to Egypt to try to find food, we know the story that they come before Joseph. But by this time, he looks a little different, gotten older, and they didn't recognize him, especially as second in command of all Egypt. And it was only after he revealed himself to the brothers that they understood who he was. And he tells them to go and get their father and bring him to Egypt and so on. His father comes to Egypt, and the father gives blessings to the family and passes away. Well, after the father, Jacob, passes away, the brothers all think they're in trouble now. You know, the father's gone. What's their brother going to do? Get revenge on him for all that they did to him. In chapter 50 and verse 20, you may want to go and highlight that or something. 50 and 20. Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Twice in his life now, Joseph had lost his liberty. He had been sold into slavery, and he had been put in prison. He had lost his liberty. He had been unjustly treated by his brothers and then Potiphar's wife, and he had done nothing wrong. What about Joseph's people? My third point is we see injustice from a Pharaoh, and that takes us into the book of Exodus. And you know the story. Joseph and his family come looking for food. Then more of them come, so there ends up being 70 that come to Egypt. And we are told that in verse 5 of chapter 1 of Exodus. Now over time, of course, those 70 multiplied. They have children, and so on over the years. Well, over time, that kind Pharaoh and Joseph himself and others, of course, all passed away. And there were new pharaohs in charge. And as time went along, the new Egyptian rulers were not kind to the Israelites, or the Hebrews as they called them then. And they actually enslaved them. They were no longer just guests in their country. Now they were enslaved. They were made to work to help make the bricks and work in really bad conditions. They were treated unjustly with whips to the back and all sorts of mistreatment and cruelty. We know the story in Exodus, how the people cry out and God sends Moses. Moses goes to speak for God and tells Pharaoh what? "Let my people go." We know about Moses. We know about the 10 plagues on Egypt. We know how eventually the people got their freedom as God sent these plagues, and they were able to escape the treatment of their slave masters. 70 people had come from the promised land, from Israel. When the Exodus happened and they were about to leave Egypt many years later, 600,000 men left and their families, so much more than 600,000. So the whole people had been unjustly treated by the Egyptian slave masters, pharaohs. Next, we see my fourth point, injustice for a whole religion. We've gone from Joseph, we've gone to his people, now we're going to all of the Jewish religion. You know, we know in the Bible over and over and over that God's people, the Jews, are mistreated, aren't they? Usually that mistreatment comes from jealousy. God blessed them, they were hard workers, so they prospered about anywhere they went, and that just made people more jealous and more upset. And they were always persecuted. Remember the story of Esther, the book of Esther? How she was put in place by God to save the Jewish people, what does it say there? For such a time as this. For all their history, the Jews, like I said, also called Hebrews and Israelites, have always been mistreated. In the country of Russia, at one time it held more Jews than anyone in the world. But by the year 1922, some 150,000 Jews were killed because of hatred and anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jews. The Soviet government arrested rabbis, they seized Jewish properties, and dissolved many Jewish communities. If you remember the movie Fiddler on the Roof, at the very end of it's very sad when the people are forced by the Russian authorities to leave their little town. Things got a little better by the time World War II started, but of course we know Stalin came to power, and then things got worse after that. And we know what happened during World War II itself to the Jewish people. Imagine if you had 6 million $1 bills. Would that make you happy? Imagine them all stacked up. 6 million $1 bills all in front of you. But then imagine if each of those dollar bills represented a Jewish life that was killed in Adolf Hitler's Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. By the way, that was one of the earliest attempts from people to rewrite history, to try to say the Holocaust never happened. And of course we know it did. 6 million Jews, over 12 million people in all, died in the concentration camps. And these Jews died just because they were Jewish. And by the way, Hitler, when he was in power, he tore down statues and he banned books. And so he wanted to just have his way of thinking get across to the people. All that was from nothing but hatred, nothing but loss of liberty and justice to the Jewish people. So you say, oh, all this stuff's nice, all this happened to the Jews, it happened a long time ago. What's it all got to do with the 4th of July? My 5th point. Injustice comes home. Did you ever see the movie Roots? It was quite the sensational movie when it came out. It tells of the black author, his name was Alex Haley, tells of his attempt to trace his family's roots back all the way back to Africa. Lamar Burton played a young black man named Kunta Kinte, you might remember. It showed how his life was in the village. He was happy with his family. He was learning its rituals and morals, just like anybody else in the world does with their family when they're growing up. But suddenly his world is turned upside down, isn't it? He is kidnapped by slave traders. He is no longer treated like a young man. Now he's only treated like an animal. And he and his friends are all put on ships, bound for a place called Virginia. And so it began. Do you know how long the Hebrews worked as slaves in Egypt? Do you know? A little over 400 years. Well, how long has it been since Kunta Kinte and the slaves were taken away from their homes to a place far away? Well, it's been about 400 years or so now. During the 1800s, My descendants, and some of yours, the Irish, were forced from their homes, and they came to America for a new start. They wanted to escape tyranny and injustice. They wanted to look for new liberty, for new freedom. These refugees were poor and they were disease-ridden. They threatened to take jobs away from Americans, the Americans thought. And most of the Irish were Catholic, and so they seemed to worship a different leader, somebody called the Pope. By the way, Catholics are still Christian, by the way. Nearly 2 million Irish crossed the Atlantic because of the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. Most of the absentee English landlords had cared very little for the Irish. They had been denied the right to vote or own their own land. One English so-called nobleman said, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be mitigated." What's that mean? It means he thought that they should not step in to help their fellow man. Let's just keep them in poverty. Let's just basically keep them in slavery is what it amounted to. Let's treat them very unjustly. And so they came to America seeking justice and freedom. But they were different because of their religion and some of their dialect, I guess you would say, in their language. In 1844 in Philadelphia, anti-Irish mobs destroyed houses and burned Catholic churches. Rumors were started, and they said that priests raped nuns and any children born were strangled to death by the Catholic. You know, rumors always start the fires of hatred, don't they? Of course, hatred starts the rumors, and then they just spread and makes the hatred even grow more. And they are false rumors, of course. This anti-Catholic hatred kept going past the 1840s. It wasn't until 1960. What happened in 1960? We had our first Irish Catholic president elected, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And there was great commotion about that. There were still many people who had hatred against the Irish Catholic people. So we could talk about the Irish. We could talk about the Jews whose synagogues in New York and other places are still being attacked today by those who hate just because the Jews are different. In many places, Italians and other immigrants have not been treated well either, and we could tell their stories. What about Native Americans, the very first Americans? They got along well with the Pilgrims at the very first Thanksgiving, but over the years, the new nation seemed to think it had something given from God, something called a manifest destiny. That meant the right from God for this nation to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Can you find manifest destiny in your Bible? I don't think so. The rights of Native Americans were trampled over. They were treated unjustly. Many came from the east and went into the west, and many Indians were killed, and they finally had to give up. Many have integrated into society today, but there are still reservations where there are problems of poverty and other social issues. Is that liberty and justice for all? Is that the Christian way of doing things? Let's go back to the blacks who came from Africa. From before there was the United States of America, from the year 1600, give or take, to 1863, for over 200 years, black family after black family, generation after generation of people whose crime was that they were black. They were brought here from countries far away, in chains, away from their families, against their will. Would you have liked if somebody did that to you and your family, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and all your relatives? Would you have liked that? Why was that done? So rich white plantation owners could get richer and not worry about how crops are going to be picked. The enslavement of a whole race of people just because they were of a different color. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. We know it took quite a while for word to spread until June 19th, when slaves in the West finally got the word. And so now we have the Juneteenth celebration that we recently had, and some people had never heard the term before, including the president, evidently. Juneteenth is the celebration of the end of slavery for all black men and women. You know, we just celebrated West Virginia Day not long ago, just a few days ago, the birthday of the state. What led to West Virginia becoming its own state? Because people here did not think slavery was right. They wanted no part of the Confederacy, which fought for slavery. And so they tore away from Virginia and became West Virginia. Yes, they were free. The blacks were freed after the Emancipation Proclamation. But it would take many, many years after the end of the Civil War, after the Reconstruction period, after the beginning of black schools, so that they could get on their feet. Just imagine if you had been a slave on a plantation. You were told to do everything. You had no freedom. Then all of a sudden you were freed, but you had no land, you had no money, you had no job, you had no education. All because your freedom had been taken away, and all the injustice that had been done to your family for generation after generation. Just imagine if it was you. The KKK and white supremacy had been born out of sheer hatred, born out of sheer ignorance, born out of sheer jealousy, and it still exists today. And those people have hatred in their hearts and in their minds of these white people. They say in some cases that they are Christians, but they do not act like it with this hate in their heart. Did you hear just the other day, the only black NASCAR driver that there is found a noose in his locker? What does that say about people's mentality even today? Thankfully, many of the NASCAR drivers supported that young man, as you may have seen the day or two after, and all gathered around together. Even Richard Petty was there, as I saw. Do we think that's funny, him having a noose in his locker? What if your people had a history of being lynched? Would you think it was so funny? Being treated so unfairly? Go back to Tulsa, Oklahoma of 1921. Of course, President Trump just went there for a rally this past weekend. By this time, some blacks in Tampa in Tulsa rather, in 1921, had gotten onto their feet. It had been, about 50 years since the end of slavery. And it had taken that long for them to get on their feet and start establishing their own businesses. And there was an area there called Negro Wall Street. Today they call it Black Wall Street, but back then originally it was called Negro Wall Street, I guess by the white people. And in that area, there were things like black-owned newspapers. They had their own two different movie theaters, a commercial strip of some of the finest black-owned businesses in all the nation were found there in Tulsa. Well, in the white community of Tulsa, they saw a lot of this as an obstacle to Tulsa's expansion. They thought these black business people were just uppity. The white paper even called it Nigger Town. They tried to claim that their clubs were all immoral and full of vice just to make them sound awful. Along the way, a black man was accused of attacking a white woman. Well, a mob gathered to lynch that man and things spiraled out of control. The city started to deputize mob members. This area of Oklahoma was a strong place of a lot of KKK. And the men were told, as they were deputized, get a gun and get busy and try to get a nigger. There was a black man who was well known in the white community of Tulsa. He was blind and he had had amputations on both legs, and he wore baseball catcher's mitts, big catcher's mitts on each hand, because he would have to scoot himself along on the ground, and he'd use that to cushion his hand as he went along on the sidewalk. He would try to sell pencils to make a living and sing for coins. Well, a white teenager named E.W. Maxey saw what happened to that man when all these mobs of white people came to Black Wall Street to destroy it. This man was tied to a convertible and he was dragged down Main Street. The witness said he was hollering, his head was being bashed in, bouncing on the steel rails and bricks that lined the streets. The man was shredded to death. Meanwhile, 40 square blocks of the black business district was torched. 1,000 homes, 12 churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctor offices, a public library, a hospital, all burned down over 2 days, even with airplanes dropping incendiary devices on the area from above. That was the first time Americas were bombed on their own land, not Pearl Harbor, but Tulsa of 1921. All because of hatred, all because of people being treated unjustly and their life, their liberty to life and happiness all taken away just because they're of a different color. We all remember the 1960s. We remember the protests. We remember the crowds that were sprayed with fire hoses. Dogs were sent to attack protesters. Civil rights supporters had their buses burned. Some were killed. Protesters were arrested. Flash forward now to the events of the last few years for the black community, even the last few months. How many times have blacks been pulled over and falsely charged? How many, such as those in the recent movie called Just Mercy, have spent many years in prison for crimes they did not commit? In Alabama alone, according to the movie trailer, over 140 men had their cases reviewed and were found to be innocent and were let out of prison. Would you like to have served 20 or 30 years in prison for something you didn't do? How can you pay somebody back for that? Then we've had the killings by police officers we've seen in recent months. Maybe these individuals who were killed were lawbreakers and had done a lot of things wrong. They didn't deserve to be killed the way they were. They should have been arrested and taken to trial. We recently heard of 2 men found, I believe it's in California, 50 miles apart, hanging from trees. Supposedly unrelated. Supposedly both suicides. Really? Then, and then, and then it just continues. How much longer until justice comes? Can we begin to see why the black community has had it? Can we begin to see that they've had nothing but hatred from people over the years, injustice shown to them, people who were inhumane and some who still are, very unchristian things done and said to them? How much longer? Black lives do matter. They are created in God's image, just like white people, yellow people, brown people are. If I was to simply say the term black person to you, my white brother or sister watching, what would your first thought be if I just said black person? What would you think? Are you prejudiced in what you're thinking? Are black people more stupid than you are? Are black people somebody you want to stay away from? Do black people deserve to be treated like the rest of us? Are black people people? After 400 years from slavery to plantations to Tulsa to Jim Crow laws to segregation, yes, separate but equal education, to KKK, to lynchings, to discrimination, to police brutality. I think black folks have a lot to be upset about. Their liberties have been taken away over time. They've been cruelly and unjustly treated many times. Why? Because they look different from white people. I found out recently, for a very short time, when my mom was a baby, she had a mammy, which I didn't know about. I also found out the grandfather that I grew up and dearly loved hated black people. I know he voted for Wallace, but I didn't know how much he didn't like black people until my mom told me some things. That doesn't mean I have to be like that. That doesn't mean I have to have the same thoughts. You know, none of us have to continue any kind of hate or prejudice we may have grown up with or heard about in our families for anyone else in the world, no matter what color. Yes, Jews are different. Every immigrant group, the Irish, the Poles, the Italians, they're different in culture and language and religion. You hear the jokes, you hear people being discriminated against. Native Americans, yes, they're different. You know, we could talk about the Asian Americans that were mistreated after Pearl Harbor, the Arab Americans who were mistreated after 9/11, but you can kind of understand those two events. America had been attacked, and so people had to be, the authorities had to be careful, especially. But what about all these other injustices that have happened? White people have a way of just thinking about it and feeling sorry about it and then moving on. Don't think about it much anymore. But it happens over and over and over and over, generation after generation. Today, the Black Lives Matter movement is strong. The peaceful protesters, did you hear me say peaceful protesters? Peaceful protesters only want something that we all want, and that is fairness and equality. To be treated fair and equal like everyone else. Because for people who know their history, they have definitely not been treated peacefully. Now, have all the protesters been peaceful? No. There have been looters and lawbreakers that need to be arrested. Some have been agitators and anarchists. I saw recently there was an ad from Antifa. And they were willing to pay people to show up at certain major cities at certain times to cause trouble, to just come out and cause trouble in these major cities. Some have even come from other countries. Some are just plain mean people who take advantage of these peaceful protest movements, and they start burning and they start pillaging and they start robbing and stealing, often from their own black brothers and sisters' businesses. There's no excuse for these people who are being violent. They should be arrested and dealt with. Should statues be torn down? You know, you might be able to understand why they have a problem with Confederate statues that remind them of the injustices over the many years and slavery and everything. You know, why do we revere people like Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis? You know, maybe we had in our background great-great-great-grandfathers, whatever, who may have fought in the Civil War. That doesn't mean the Civil War was right, folks. I hate to tell you, but the Civil War was mainly to try to defend slavery so the South could continue to have slavery and the plantations could continue to do as they'd been doing, making money and such. It was an unjust cause. And maybe those statues shouldn't. I would say the statues need to be taken down and moved maybe to a museum or something. But if you are someone whose ancestors had been slaves and people were revering these statues, I think you would have a problem with them too in some cases. That doesn't mean they should tear them down. You know, when Lenin, and if you remember Lenin's statue in Russia, it was taken down. When Saddam Hussein was defeated in Iraq, that statue came down. You know, there have been many black speakers in recent days and weeks who have come out and said all the statues should stay up. They should stay as reminders of the history so that it can be remembered and not repeated. You know, Hitler tried to again burn all the books and take down the statues. He wanted to get rid of certain things. He wanted to kill the Jews to get rid of them, get rid of things he didn't like. You can't just get rid of statues. You just can't take down certain things because you don't like it. You know, I thought one of the most crazy things I heard about was the statue for the President Grant that was taken down in San Francisco. President Grant led the North against the South, against the slavery of the Confederacy. President Grant became president and fought for the rights of blacks to have education and even to vote. Yes, if you saw the mini-series on History Channel not long ago on Grant, he had a slave, but he was given that slave by his wife's family. And he let that slave have his freedom at a time when Grant was poor. He could have gotten money from that slave, but instead he let him go instead of selling him to someone. And then they tear down his statue. You know, it's like people who are trying to tear down George Washington because he had slaves, or Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. These people are just anarchists. They either don't know their history or they're just trying to cause more and more trouble, and they don't care. It has nothing to do at all with the Black Lives Matter movement, in my view. What about cops? Are all cops bad? Of course not. Or there may be some people who are law enforcement officers whose attitudes need to be changed and adjusted. Well, I dare say people watching this message has attitudes that need to be adjusted. Maybe some officers have broken the laws and have done things where they deserve to be arrested. I believe that's the case in some cases. Do policemen of all colors need to be trained differently and treat each other fairly? Yes, I would say so. But we need to support all of our officers. They're out there doing the best they can to support and defend and protect us as citizens. And you hear stories after stories now of people who want to defund the police. What a stupid idea. That's not the way to go. Some people want to take away their weapons, take away things that will weaken the policemen so that they can be trained better or whatever. You need to have both. You need to have better training, yes, but they have to be they have to have the weapons and the things that they need to do their jobs, to defend people's properties and lives. It wasn't long ago in Tampa, Florida, where a call was put in of shots fired, and so 2 officers showed up, and when they showed up they were ambushed by hundreds of people, and at least 100 other officers had to be called in from across Tampa to help them, and the officers were hurt. And now we hear stories of officers who are retiring or calling in sick or quitting. Well, I wonder why. We need to support our officers. If a handful is doing something wrong, they need to be arrested, they need to be dealt with. If there needs to be training, then that needs to be done so some of these atrocities against people who are arrested are not committed. But they have an awful hard job to do. There's not too many criminals who are willing to go down quietly. A lot of them try to fight back. A lot of them do things they shouldn't do. So, there's a little bit of wrong on both sides, and there's room for improvement on both sides. There's not just one side that's completely right and just, I don't believe. All of it, though, all this anger and all this mistreatment, and all the statues being taken down, and all of this hatred. There is great hatred, there's great prejudice, and that's not the way it's supposed to be, but there's a lot of it. We even see a lot of it in I guess even maybe say it started in some ways in the political landscape. When people don't like Trump, and so they just they don't get their way and they get madder and madder about things that happen and so on. And we have just a diametrically opposed country. We have half the country that believes one thing and half that believes something else. And the election coming up should be interesting. But it's just two totally different views. And some people may call it good versus evil. And there's probably some truth to that if you think about it. You know, if God looks at the inside of a person to see who they're all about, then shouldn't we do the same thing? Shouldn't we look inside a person to see what they're all about? To get to know somebody, no matter what their race might be? We might be surprised at how similar we are after all. You know, in the world there are Chinese and Russians who don't like Americans. There are Americans who don't like Chinese and Russians. Why? Because of hatred, prejudice, ignorance. It goes on and on. I remember a episode of Star Trek, the old Star Trek, where there are Klingons on the ship along with Kirk and his men, and there's an alien presence that had come in, and the alien presence was encouraging each side to hate each other more because that alien presence fed on the hatred. You know, the more they were arguing, the more they were fighting, then the more life force this alien had. But when they were being more quiet and peaceful and talking, that alien life force had less. Could we compare that to Satan? You think Satan wants to see brother fighting against brother, people arguing with each other, the country falling apart? You know he does. You know that's exactly what Satan wants to see. Think about Jesus at that well. Remember the well, Jacob's well? Out of all the people Jesus could have revealed himself to, he chose a woman. Remember the story? It wasn't so long that women also had to protest and march for their rights, was it? But that's another story. But for this woman, Jesus chose this woman, but not just any woman. It was a Samaritan woman. Remember the story? The woman who belonged to a group the Jews hated, if you remember, because when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken away by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, they took away the Jewish people from the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, and they put back in people from Babylon and other places. And so over time, the people who lived there were not pure Jewish. They became Samaritans, if you will. And so the Jewish people didn't like the Samaritan people. Again, you have this mixture. Again, you have differences. Again, you have hatred and prejudice. But this woman comes along, and for Jesus, you know, for Jesus, he helped male, he helped female. He helped Jew, he helped Gentile. He helped the rich, he helped the poor. We are told he loved everyone. And Christian, shouldn't we love everyone as well? On this July 4th week we have coming up, as we think about the words of Pledge of Allegiance and what it really means, liberty, justice for all, maybe we need to look into ourselves and understand our prejudices, our ignorance, even our hatred that we may have, if we're honest with ourselves. Is it time to get rid of those unchristian attitudes and be more like Christ? God knows your heart. As the people march, as they protest, yes, as even some of them take a knee, and we certainly have different things about that, don't we? Some athletes, some football athletes have said that taking a knee is to protest racial injustice and police brutality, that it has nothing to do with the flag or dishonoring the nation. Well, if that's the case, I wish they would find a different way to do it, or a different time to do it, and still respect the flag. If it wasn't for the freedom of being an American, none of us could protest or speak out, could we? We would be thrown in jail or even worse. Men have died for that flag, and it should always be respected. I recently heard LeBron James, one of the best players in the NBA basketball, said that he would not play if the anthem was played. Now that's a different story. Now you're talking about you are disrespecting the flag. You are disrespecting the anthem clearly. And if that's the case, then we need to boycott the NFL and the NBA if that's going to be the case. I'm all for Black Lives Matter. I'm all for all lives matter. I'm all for addressing the inequality and the problems of the past and constructively working together to try to do something about it, to treat each other equally. But I'm also for standing for the flag and what it means. And if we were not Americans, we wouldn't have the rights to protest and the rights to do the things that people are doing today. People don't stop and think about that. What would it be like if you were in China or Russia or somewhere like that? You know, our nation was started by people who felt like they were being mistreated by King George in England, remember? There were higher taxes they didn't like. They were having taxation without representation. In Boston, the Quartering Act meant that English soldiers could live in people's homes against their will there in Boston. There were 13 colonies who wanted to be free, and England would not let them be free. They just wanted to be treated fairly, and they weren't. They were there were taxes that were unjust. That's the word I'm looking for. Unjust taxes, left and right. It was all about being treated fairly then, but they were not being treated fairly, and so it led to the Revolutionary War. Again, Black Lives Matter, but so do every other color. Police and soldiers' lives matter as well. They are the ones who proudly defend our nation, who we should support. They defend it with their lives, and we should support them in any way we can. A friend of mine back in Mount Airy, I saw she posted something on Facebook for the Mount Airy Police Department. It said, if you're someone who's hungry, stop by my house. I'll fix you something or go out and buy you something. If you're thirsty, I'll get you something to drink. If you need to cry, you can cry on my shoulder. I'm here for you and whatever you need. That's the way we need to support our policemen. We need to support them in every way we can, especially in the days we're seeing now. It's a shame, I saw in the paper this morning, where they had to send National Guard soldiers to defend the Lincoln Monument of all things. The very man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. There's just people involved in this, folks, who have nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter. They're using it. Whether it's Antifa or other anarchists, they're just trying to tear apart this nation. And I've seen, what's the fellow's name? George Soros. Have some things in the past. He said something about paying people to cause commotion and things, especially among the black community. I mean, it's many cases it's a well-planned kind of thing to cause anarchy and trouble, disrupt our nation. It's really doing a disservice to the Black Lives Matter movement and people who are speaking out against inequality. Our country is still growing, isn't it? You got to remember, we're a relatively young country when compared to other nations in the world. Our country is still adapting and changing. It still has growing pains. There are many things that are wrong that need to be fixed and needs to be improved. But how about inside of us? Do we have anything inside of us that needs to be fixed, that needs to be improved? Perhaps from all of this pain and turmoil, we can all understand how important it is to change shoes. Have you ever changed shoes with somebody? Change shoes. Because when you change shoes, you start to walk in their shoes. You start to understand where they're coming from and what they are seeing and how they're being treated. It reminds me of that show Touched by an Angel, when Monica the Angel in one episode was black, and she saw how unjust she was being treated by different people. We have to walk in other people's shoes, folks, to understand their hurt. We as white people may look at our black brothers and sisters and we may not think much of what's going on. We may not be able to understand. You can tell some white people are like from Mars or something. They really don't get it in some cases. I'm hoping others are having their eyes opened up perhaps and their understanding that we all need to be treated fairly and justly in this nation. As we grow, as our nation grows, but as we grow as individuals, may we pray that people learn to follow Jesus' example and treat others fairly and equally. Always follow what Jesus said were the two greatest commandments. What were they? To love the Lord your God with all your mind, body, soul, strength, etc. And to love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. The greatest injustice ever done in the history of the world was when Jesus was crucified for doing nothing at all, the Son of God. He was killed on the cross of Calvary. But even with that evil, even with that injustice, God was able to turn it and use it for the greatest good, wasn't He? We need to pray for our nation. A nation founded by men who stood up to the tyranny and evil of men like King George III in the Revolutionary War, or the prejudice of the Confederacy and its President Jefferson Davis in the Civil War. We need to pray for our nation, and we need to be proud of how this small, young country stood up and saved the world in the 2 world wars. It saved the world from the tyranny of Germany, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy and Japan. It became the leader of the free world. And as the Statue of Liberty shows, we welcome people to come, to leave the injustice of their own land and come to a place where they can be free. Much like the early colonists came to America, to the New World, looking for wealth, looking for freedom, looking for a new start, people come today looking for the same things. Now, we don't approve of illegal immigration, but when people come and they want to learn our language and they want to learn our laws, they want to go through the legal hoops, a legal course to become an American citizen, we should welcome them to our land, the land of the free and the home of the brave, a place where we hope one day will truly be liberty and justice for all. May we pray for understanding. May we pray for peace in our land. May we pray for an end to the destroying of statues and instead understand our history and admit it's not perfect and work to make things better. Changes need to be made. Our goal should be a goal of equality where everyone is treated fairly in all matters. Our land is great. Our land is something to be proud of. May we continue to help it grow and improve, and may we all work on getting rid of any hate or injustice or prejudice in our heart and replace it with God's love. Only then can we be the people and the country that God wants us to be. May God bless the USA. God bless you.